So what we've seen so far is that we become humane as the result of all of these social emotional interactions we've had with developmentally mature adults, and this is the path our kids take. But there are two issues that we need to be aware of in particular at the moment, and they are, first of all, in evolutionary terms, Bruce Perry points out that there's been an enormous decrease in the size of households. Now, this graph that he published is obviously out of scale, from 10,000 BC on the left and only 40-year gaps on the right. But he makes the point that in evolutionary terms, as a hunter-gatherer society, human children were part of multi-family and multi-generational groups. That the average ratio of developmentally mature adults to each young person was 4 to 1, and that this is a relationally rich environment where the young person learns from, on average, 4 developmentally mature adults at any particular time. To the situation we have now in our schools, for example, where we believe that 1 adult to 25 kids is an optimal ratio. So there's great relational poverty, Bruce Perry says, in evolutionary terms for the human race, with our young people now having less and less exposure to interaction with developmentally mature adults. He says typically, and it's worth looking at this quote in particular, typically the typical American 18-year-old in a typical loving family, so not a kid in foster care or in the system or something like that, but in a typical loving family who watches the average hours of television that kids watch and has the typical separate bedroom and the typical amount of screen time in a day, taken over 18 years, would have the same number of social emotional learning opportunities that 30 years ago a kid of 6 would have experienced. So by 18, they're having the same number of those developmentally important interactions as would have been achieved by age 6 30 years ago or a generation ago. He says what we're doing is producing 18-year-olds that have the cognitive skills of an 18-year-old, but the social and emotional skills of a 6-year-old. And this speaks of the relational poverty. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a lot of modern society and the way people live. You know, it's good to have mobility, which means that families can move away for work or for opportunities, move away from extended family, so they're not with grandparents or aunts and uncles. It's great that kids can have their own bedroom, whereas in previous generations they would have shared the bedroom. It's great to have televisions, and maybe to have televisions even in the bedroom. But if that means that they spend more time interacting with screens than they do with other people, then it simply reduces the relational strength. It reduces the relational experience that that kids have. And it's not unusual to see, for example, a family at a restaurant with mum and dad on their phone and the kids on their iPad, not interacting with one another. And Perry describes this from a neuroscientific or a neuropsych point of view, that this causes relational poverty. And that has a lot of consequences down the track. He concludes that it's important for us to think intentionally and deliberately about creating social, emotional, relationally enriched curriculum as it is to talk about STEM. In fact, he would say it's more essential that we develop intentional opportunities for relational enrichment in schools so that kids can express their potential. And this is something new in the last 30 years, let's say, as a result of societal changes, but also technological changes. The second issue is about adolescence. Adolescence is said to, or it's defined as beginning in biology and ending in culture. The onset of adolescence is timed or is brought about by the onset of puberty. So it's a hormonal thing, the start of adolescence, and that's why Lawrence Steinberg, who's an adolescent psychologist, describes it as beginning in biology. And it ends in culture because adolescence generally lasts until kids on average are independent of their parents and functioning as in the adult world. In the 1800s, a couple of hundred years ago, the onset of puberty was around age 15, and kids were independent of their parents around age 18, 19. So adolescence was only 4 or 5 years, tops. By the 1950s, increased nutrition in particular had resulted in earlier onset of puberty, but the time at which young people left the home and became independent adults didn't change much, got a little bit older. But puberty was seen in the 1950s and 60s as commencing on average around age 13. Steinberg points out that most people these days define the start of adolescence at around age 10 and 11. That the onset of puberty is becoming younger and younger, and he puts that down to 3 factors, 3 reasons. He says, yes, it's increased nutrition, but it's more, in fact, increased calorie intake. So the rise of obesity is starting puberty earlier. The hormonal precursors in the environment, so in our food and in the environment to which we're exposed, actually initiates puberty earlier. And screen time. The blue light from screens changes us hormonally, and that's in particular having an impact, he believes, on the reduction in the time for the start of puberty. Similarly, in the 2000s, kids are staying at home longer, and the end of adolescence is somewhere in the 20s. Or is considered to be somewhere in the 20s now on average. Now, this should be important to us as educators to understand the implications of this. There are 3 systems that develop during adolescence. Steinberg calls them the 3 R's: the reward system, the relationship system, and the regulatory system. The reward system and the relationship system are part of the limbic system, and they start their development, or their key point for development is the start of puberty. Now they're the accelerator, if you like. The reward system and the relationship system are those aspects of adolescent behaviour that drive kids to seek reward and to join relationships outside the family home. So they're the gas pedal, or the green light, if you like, to experience things and to take risks. And that starts to develop seriously with the limbic system at the start of adolescence. The regulatory system is our ability to use our prefrontal cortex for what we call executive function, for seeing the consequences, predicting the consequences of behaviour, and maybe deciding not to do something that might be risky, and follow a better course of action. It's the brake pedal, if you like. And that comes into its own in terms of development around the 17, 18-year-old mark. That's the peak of it. Obviously, these exist in the young child in underdeveloped ways right from birth, but these are the peak areas for development. So in the 1800s, The gas pedal only sort of came into existence for the adolescent a few years, 3 or 4 years before they had the capacity to really make good decisions about things. By the 1950s, of course, you've got a larger gap between the development of the limbic system and the coming online in a real sense of the prefrontal cortex. Now, what we're talking about here in terms of the regulatory system and the reward and relationship system is the ability of students to self-regulate, the ability to be aware of and exercise control over our feelings, thoughts and behaviour. And until the regulatory system is right in place, until the 17-18 mark, self-regulation is poorer. So by the 1950s, the time period, the gap between when the limbic system starts to develop and when the prefrontal cortex really comes into its own is getting longer. And by the 2000s, it's even further apart. So we're talking about a period of 7 or 8 years, as opposed to, in evolutionary terms, 3 or 4 years. And one of the things that, one of the consequences of that is that when we're teaching kids now, it's really our job as the developmentally mature adult, often to be the prefrontal cortex for these kids. In other words, to be the one who thinks of the consequences of actions and talks them through, making good decisions. So this developmental relationship, this relationship between the developmentally mature adult, these interactions become critically important from a brain sense, or brain development sense as well. Steinberg says the capacity for self-regulation, remember, the ability to be aware of and to control our feelings, thoughts and behaviour, in other words, to act as an adult with executive function, is probably the single most important contributor to achievement, mental health and social success in later life. In another text, he says, and he reports from his studies, that self-regulation turns out to be a stronger predictor of success in the classroom even than previous standardized test scores, and a stronger predictor than intelligence or talent, however that's measured. Bob Marzano, master of the meta-study, in the new taxonomy upon which the new senior regime in Queensland is based, says developing self-regulation should be a fundamental goal of education. That it is so critical to students' success, to their mental health, to their social success, their school achievement, that self-regulation, the ability to be aware of and control feelings, actions, thoughts, should be a fundamental goal of education. So if we look again at those cognitive and non-cognitive capacities, where we've got to here is that every interaction we have with a young person changes their brain. Everything we say, everything we do has the potential to reinforce particular neural circuits and to help prune other neural circuits. Hattie, in his meta-studies, he says that he can summarize all of his results in these 3 words: to know the impact. Know the impact that you have on kids, and the impact that various strategies use. And down the right-hand side are all the effect sizes that Hattie reports for the various different interventions. And I know you can't see those, but we're going to look at a couple in particular. You might be familiar with this effectometer that Hattie uses in some of his books, where he identifies that an effect size of 0.4 or more is something worth doing in schools, that's a significant, will have a significant impact on student achievement. And if you look at the very top of the list of what is most effective in terms of increasing achievement of students in schools, Hattie spends a lot of time on feedback. All of much of visible learning is about the quality of feedback, and feedback has a large effect size, 0.73 quality feedback given to students. But if you look just beside quality feedback is teacher-student relationships on 0.72. And just above that is classroom behavioural on 0.8. And it leads Hattie to conclude, and this is one of the major conclusions from visible learning, he says it's teachers who have created positive student-teacher relationships that actually have the above average effects on all the other techniques. So all the other techniques are more effective, they have a larger effect size, if they're correlated with positive teacher-student relationships. The Australian Society for Evidence-Based Teaching promotes the idea of high-performance relationships, and it's an idea, or it's a model that appeals to me. Once again, we have a two-dimensional field of practice with press or challenge on the vertical axis and care on the horizontal axis. And they describe authoritarian relationships between adults and students being ones of high press but low care. So demanding authoritarian relationships would be like that. They would have a lot of challenge, and we challenge the kids, but we don't necessarily express a lot of care. And similarly, if an overly friendly relationship would be one full of care, but little press, little push, little challenge in the relationship to be the best form of themselves. And obviously we can have aloof relationships between teachers and students. But the society describes what they call high performance relationships. And they're relationships which achieve high performance, if you like, in the students, as being a potent combination of press and care. Push and challenge on one axis and care and support on the other. So if we go back to Jack and we look at his cognitive capacities and his non-cognitive capacities, Jack doesn't see that distinction. It's just Jack. Schools see the distinction, and schools often treat them as, two sides of the same coin. Then we have people who look after the cognitive capacities, they're the teachers and coordinators of subjects, and we have pastoral care people who look after the non-cognitive capacities. My challenge to you today is to not see this as two sides to the same coin, but rather to see it as the alloy, as the meld, the metal itself that makes up the coin. Is an alloy of different metals. It's an alloy of cognitive capacities and non-cognitive capacities. Jack doesn't turn on the cognitive capacities and turn off the non-cognitive ones, and vice versa. And in fact, Steinberg makes this point. He says non-cognitive skills is actually a misnomer. The distinction is not between thinking and not thinking. It's between factors which are intellectual, factors which are cognitive and intellectual and academic, and those which are motivational. Now, motivational factors are usually, for the human being, emotional factors. Motivation is about the limbic system interacting with the cortex. The intellectual factors is about the cortex, the neocortex, and the prefrontal cortex. It's all cortical work. So instead of seeing cognitive development and behaviour management as two separate parts of activity in a school, I'd encourage you to look at it as simply student development, because the two are inextricably linked. And that's recognised in Marzano and Kendall's new taxonomy, again, upon which the new senior regime is built. Marzano and Kendall in this document define three domains of knowledge: the information, the mental procedures, and the psychomotor procedures, that are what we're trying to teach the kids cognitively. But that we process this information, whether it's cognitive information or psychomotor processes, we process this only through three systems: the self system, the metacognitive system, and the cognitive system. The self system Marzano and Kendall say, is actually, it's the port of entry for all learning. Because the self system is what judges, is this task that I'm being asked to do meaningful to me? Do I have a chance of success at it? Is it going to be worthwhile if I put energy into it? And these are all motivational or non-cognitive factors that are the entry to learning. So we spend a lot of our time in the cognitive. Marzano and Kendall here are calling us to think about the self system and the motivation. The metacognitive system is then about how we manage the learning process. And both of these, Marzano says, have to be negotiated before you can engage the cognitive system. Perry puts it a different way. He says that you need to regulate before you can relate to kids and before you can reason. And what he's saying there is you need to calm the brainstem, the amygdala, by regulating before you can relate through the limbic system to access the cortex, to access the cognitive system. And it matches here with Marzano's scheme. So just to reiterate, the American Psychological Association published in 2015 distilled 20 principles that they believe are well proven in psychology that K-12 teachers should be aware of. And I'm just going to pull out a few. Interpersonal relationships and communication are critical to both the teaching and learning process and the social emotional development of students. So interpersonal relationships, both academic and social emotional development. Emotional well-being influences educational performance, learning and development. Students' self-regulation assists learning, and self-regulatory skills can be taught. We can teach kids how to become aware of their feelings, their thoughts, and control their actions. And finally, that effective classroom management is based on setting and communicating high expectations and providing a high level of student support. In other words, working in that top right-hand corner and consistently nurturing positive relationships.